Hello, I'm Graham West and welcome to Rhythm of Rock 4. About 4 or 5 years ago, I produced a 3-part series of DVDs that deal with the rhythmical aspects of rock and roll. And I called our series The Rhythm of Rock. In those first 3 DVDs, I zeroed right in on a special kind of syncopation which I had noticed was always associated with rock and roll and its predecessors. And I called that form of syncopation beat anticipation. In those first videos, I gave examples of it and I laboured to explain how it actually elicits a sensual response from the listener. And my purpose in this lecture is clearly to define beat anticipation. Let me start by giving you a succinct technical definition. Beat anticipation is syncopation that moves the natural position of the accent by causing the last note of the musical phrase to fall off the beat immediately before a naturally accented beat. This definition encapsulates the 3 essential features of beat anticipation. Now I want us to look at those 3 essential features separately. Number 1, beat anticipation is a form of syncopation. Number 2, it is syncopation that anticipates the strong beats or downbeats. And number 3, it is syncopation that anticipates the strong beats at the ends of the phrase. Now I've found over the years that many people, even musicians, who say that they understand what I'm talking about when I'm speaking on beat anticipation, they really don't understand at all. At best, their understanding is hazy, and they certainly could not explain it to other people. In fact, they actually, in many cases, misrepresent what I'm saying. Why is that? It's because they have not understood the importance of identifying all 3 essential features of beat anticipation. Remember, if you don't have all 3 essential features, you don't have beat anticipation. Let's start by examining that first essential feature. Beat anticipation is syncopation. That is a true statement. But those of you who are familiar with my first 3 videos understand that many times syncopation is quite harmless. It can be wholesome, adding musical interest. The visual that you can see on the screen is an example of syncopation. I'm going to play the metronome and clap the rhythm for you at the same time, just so you can see how it's supposed to work. Okay, that form of syncopation has been used for centuries. And when it's used sparingly, it provides the composer with a very useful rhythmic device to add variety to his music. We conclude that beat anticipation must therefore be distinguished from this common form of syncopation. So that brings us to the second distinguishing feature of beat anticipation, which is syncopation that anticipates the strong beats or downbeats. A friend of mine provided me with a copy of an interesting article. At that time, it could be viewed on this link. This website encourages and promotes the musical education of budding contemporary songwriters. On Saturday, November 21, 2009, the administrator of the website posted a very concise but illuminating article entitled Basic Rhythmic Phrasing. Amongst other things in that article, he distinguishes between what he calls pickups and anticipations. Now, when he comes to describe what he means by anticipations, he says this, and I quote, "To understand and feel anticipations, we will define the anticipation as a rhythmic attack that takes the place of the downbeat." The important part of this statement is that the anticipation takes the place of the downbeat. It preempts the downbeat. It does this by repositioning the strong accents, causing them to occur a split second before they naturally would occur on the strong beats. Now, before we go on, I want to clarify something about what the author is saying here when he uses the term anticipation. Firstly, I think it's a very good term because it accurately describes what's going on rhythmically. Secondly, it is not exactly the same as the device that I've called beat anticipation. Although it does have two of those essential three features, it lacks the third one. So please be careful to make a distinction in your minds between these two terms, anticipation and beat anticipation, as I will be using both of them from now on. In his article, the author points out the three different kinds of anticipation. That's his term. He refers to them in a usage of quarter notes, where they are used also with 8 notes, and how they are used with 16th notes. These three function precisely as they do in conjunction with beat anticipation, which I have demonstrated in the earlier lectures in this series. The author of this article then gives us an example of 8th note anticipation. Above the music you'll see little arrows going to the X's. This is indicating the forward movement of the body. And let me just clap this for you. Okay, now in his article he says this, and I quote, "Notice how the anticipations are tied to the note of the strong beat. There are no attacks on the strong beat, so the anticipation is felt as the strong beat played early. This is commonly referred to as the push." That's what the arrows moving to the X's are indicating. He has said something very important here. Anticipation is felt as the strong beat played early. Actually, any music that exhibits a regular meter, and that is most of our Western music, will have regular beats as well, since the regular meter is established by these regular beats. So it is not the beat that can be moved around. They must be regular, they must be predictable. In fact, why we perceive syncopation as syncopation is for that very reason, because of the regularity of the beats. Syncopation can only function with reference to a regular grid of beats which must remain constant for syncopation to have the effect that it does. So it's not really the beats that are moving around. Rather, it is the accents that are repositioned relative to those beats. Usually, the strong beats fall squarely on the downbeat in common time, on 1 and on 3. But those accents can be repositioned to wherever the musician wants to place them. In rock and roll, the characteristic use of syncopation is to reposition the strong accent so that it falls immediately before the downbeats 1 and 3. On page 3 of the website article referred to under the heading Anticipations, the author makes a very important point, and he writes, and I'll quote again, "This event is one of the devices that gives contemporary music the energy and the lift that characterises the styles." Unquote. So it would seem the author believes that all, if not the majority of contemporary music styles exhibit this anticipation on the downbeats. And he identifies this anticipation that repositions the strong accents immediately before 1 and before 3 as the device that gives contemporary music its energy and lift that characterises the styles, unquote. It follows that since, in the opinion of this author, it is anticipation that characterises the styles of contemporary music he's talking about, then we should be able to identify contemporary music by the presence of these anticipations contained within music. Now, in linking anticipation with contemporary music this way, the author is logically distinguishing its use from earlier forms of syncopation utilised in previous eras. For example, the syncopation which we find in classical music, or as we find it in folk music. Now, in these earlier periods, in the classical music and in the folk music, we find syncopation was typically, but not exclusively, achieved by repositioning the weak accents. Unlike rock and roll, which repositions the strong accents, the syncopation of the earlier periods was repositioning the weak accents, that is 2 and the 4 in the common time. And the effect of this syncopation this repositioning of syncopation rather, has less impact, certainly less sensual impact on the body. So let's just summarise all of this. We can deduce from this article that traditional sounding styles of music, when they use syncopation, will typically reposition the accents of the weak accent being 2 and 4, and that actually minimises the bodily response. On the other hand, bodily response is maximised in what the author calls anticipation, which is the form of syncopation which is associated with contemporary music styles. And unlike the traditional usage of syncopation, anticipation repositions the strong accents 1 and 3. And this is what gets the body moving and results in what the author refers to as the push. Remember the little arrow moving to the X, pushing the body into the X. Really, that X marks the position where the accent used to be, or where it should fall. And he says that this gives the music, or contemporary music at least, the energy and the lift, quote unquote, that characterises contemporary styles. Now, this is all very interesting, because in a previous lecture I cited an author, a Christian author, in fact, called John Makajina, and John has identified exactly the same device, though he describes it in different terms. John also speaks about the musical energy that anticipation transmits. He sees the rhythmic device as the main engine, in fact, which he refers to as contemporary music's, he refers to it as what makes contemporary music danceable. Refers to it as its danceability. And so here we have the two academics, both identifying a unique type of contemporary syncopation, and what's more, agreeing substantially with each other about its effect. One of them is from the secular arena, one of them from the secular music arena, and the other is from conservative Christian music circles. You could not get two music theorists so opposed or from opposite fields. So judging from what these two scholars say, anticipation of the downbeat provides a strong compulsion for the body to move, and it would seem even more than ordinary syncopation. Now this kind of syncopation that anticipates the downbeat contains the first two of the three essential ingredients that make up beat anticipation. Therefore, much of the time when you hear syncopation that has these two ingredients in it, that is, anticipation of the strong beats or downbeats, that music is going to engender a rock feel. However, there are exceptions. Sometimes anticipation has been used in music that we could not really call contemporary. It doesn't happen often, but there still is these exceptions. And this is why I have relied upon the third feature of the characteristic of which it would describe beat anticipation. These exceptions, for example, folk music of the past has employed anticipations to provide rhythmic interest. This example is typical of how anticipations are used within folk music. Notice in this example, the effect of the anticipation is somewhat neutralized by the notes that follow immediately after it. Here's another example. The second example contains two instances of anticipation, and yet once again the material that comes after it seems almost to undo, or at least in some way to balance the destabilizing effect of the anticipation. And this brings us to a very interesting point. All syncopations of any kind, including anticipations, function only by virtue of their relationship to the other notes surrounding them. We could say it another way. All anticipation has to exist in an established context. If there is no established context, then a group of notes that would otherwise constitute syncopation ceases to function as syncopation. Two factors provide that context for syncopation to function as syncopation. Firstly, syncopation by nature is a form of irregularity, and irregularity exists only in relation to something that is regular. In this case, in the case of syncopation within music, that something that is regular is a regular beat. And without the presence of a regular beat, syncopation is simply impossible. I want to show you how syncopation is dependent upon there being a regular beat. And the song that I'm going to play is the Sunday school song Somewhere in Outer Space, which contains ordinary syncopation. I can play for you exactly those same notes in the same sequence, but without a regular beat. And you will not perceive any syncopation whatsoever. There's no regularity with that whatsoever, and therefore the mind can't perceive any syncopation happening because there's no grid set up for it to happen with. So the presence of a regular beat is the first necessary factor to establish a context for the human ear to even begin to detect the presence of syncopation. The Oxford Companion to Music says that with regard to syncopation, if the feeling of regularity being thus established in the mind of the listener, irregularity is momentarily introduced, that is syncopation, unquote. Once the regular beat is established and syncopation is then contrasted against that regularity, there is the second factor that I mentioned, which further defines the context in which the syncopation is delivered. That second factor is the placement within the phrase. The position of the syncopation within the context of the musical phrase will determine the function of that syncopation. Will it engender a feeling of life and joy? Or will it contribute to conveying a message of musical lewdness? The question to ask is this: does the syncopation or the anticipation occur at the beginning of the phrase, in the middle of the phrase, or does it occur right at the end of the phrase? Typically, rock music and its predecessors, ragtime, jazz and blues, have always made use of anticipations right at the end of the phrase. They make use of it everywhere, the other two forms of syncopation as well. But these are the only forms that have made use of anticipation at the ends of the phrase, historically. And so we can see the red notes at both ends of these phrases showing how the eighth note beat anticipation looks when it is written in the score. And so we have come now to our final ingredient, the third essential ingredient of beat anticipation is the placement of an anticipation right at the end of the musical phrase. It is critical that we understand that syncopation contained throughout the phrase or at the beginning of the phrase will not necessarily promote sensual response. But when we find syncopation present as an anticipation at the end of the phrase, it always promotes a sensual response, regardless of the other factors contained within that phrase. Let me also say this. When we do that, we create an aesthetic problem. When we come to the place where we put an anticipation right at the end of the phrase, it defies the laws of art. The fine balance between tension and resolution, between unity and diversity, between regularity and irregularity. Tension throughout the phrase, whether it's harmonic tension, whether it's melodic tension or rhythmic tension, must eventually come to some kind of resolution at the end of the phrase. Every music student who has ever studied four-part harmony will understand that there are four types of cadences at the ends of each phrase which simply bring about harmonic closure to one degree or another. And they are divided into two categories, and that is the full closed cadence and the half closed cadence. Again, even in the discipline of melody writing, the final notes of each phrase must imply some kind of closure, or a sense, at least to some degree, of completeness. It's like the end of of an ordinary sentence. Grammar is understood because we have grammatical rules. Well-written melodies are the same. And it's the same in all art. Let me say this. This unwritten law of art constrains not only in the field of harmony and in the field of melody, but it constrains also the rhythm at the end of each phrase. The rhythm must resolve rhythmically, not leave you hanging. There's no problem to have a degree of rhythmic disturbance or irregularity in the middle of the phrase. That can provide interest, but the end must have closure. Syncopation, by its very nature, is irregularity, and therefore to place it in the form of an anticipation at the end of the phrase, where it should be resolving into some kind of regularity, is in defiance of that axiom. And it leaves the mind hanging in a most unsatisfactory state. Philosophically and psychologically, the human mind requires closure after tension. And if this is denied, we have unrest and we have anarchy. Art is a thing which conveys the deepest principles of the human soul. Art, whether it is music, whether it is visual arts, whether it is drama, all of these things are balanced between tension and resolution. They have that as one of the elements within them. My earlier lectures attempt to explain the psychology, the psychological effects of beat anticipation upon the human body, and I believe that Satan understands these very well also. I also believe that he has been very successful in addicting a society to this rhythmic anarchy, which so effectively promotes sensuality. So let's review our essential three elements. Since I started out by saying that I wanted this lecture to make a clear definition, let me restate that definition. We've covered a lot of ground and gone into a lot of detail since that original statement. I want to bring it back to that original statement. What are those three essential elements of beat anticipation? One, it is syncopation. Two, it is syncopation that anticipates the strong beats or the downbeats. Three, it is anticipation that anticipates the strong beats at the ends of the phrases. Remember, the form of syncopation that repositions the weak accents, that is 2 and 4, and is used throughout the phrase, can be found in most music of all types for centuries. However, sometimes this form of innocent syncopation can be made to take on a sensual aspect in the context of contemporary music particularly. That happens when we have a lot of anticipation and beat anticipation. Our purpose in this lecture has been to help us clearly define what I consider to be the most distinctive rhythmic device that communicates sensuality in worldly music, that is beat anticipation. And so I want to close this lecture by restating that summary definition that contains those three essentials that we've already just spelt out. I want to put that into one succinct statement, and we will close the same way we started the lecture by restating of that one succinct definition of beat anticipation. Beat anticipation is syncopation, that's the first element, that moves the natural position of the accent by causing the last note of the musical phrase to fall immediately before a naturally accented beat.